Fish tag. Herein lie the last wishes of character B. Naming character A as the sole beneficiary, and I'm reviewing the Q2 community initiatives.
Good morning, sir.
And to you, John. The literacy program is making a real difference.
Thanks for the feedback. We're proud of it.
Rightly so. Have a great day.
Try this word here. Remember the sound? R-A, rain, rain. That's it. Now the whole sentence.
Mr. Peterson, how do you measure the true impact of these projects?
That's a perceptive question, young lady. The impact comes from the future leaders they help create. The reports show that character 2 is ready to lead. I understand. The vision is clear. Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is revealed.
We did it!
A new era begins. A brighter future.
Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the person a billionaire trusted most. 10-year-old Ava Brooks tightened her grip on the worn strap of her small canvas bag as she stood outside the towering iron gates of Whitmore Manor. The estate stretched across dozens of acres in the rolling countryside outside Savannah, Georgia, its stone walls and towering columns glowing beneath the soft afternoon sunlight. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses moved toward the grand entrance while speaking in hushed voices about the event that had brought them there. Ava looked completely out of place among them. Her simple blue dress had been carefully pressed that morning, but it could not compete with the expensive designer clothing surrounding her. She took a deep breath and stepped forward anyway. Today marked the official reading of the final wishes left behind by Richard Whitmore, the legendary billionaire founder of Whitmore Industries. His passing had dominated headlines for weeks. Business channels discussed his fortune. Newspapers analyzed his legacy. Financial experts speculated endlessly about who would inherit control of his empire. Yet none of those conversations had anything to do with a little black girl arriving alone at the gates of his estate. Several guests noticed her immediately. Curious eyes followed her as she approached the entrance. Some appeared confused. Others looked amused. Ava lowered her gaze, but continued walking. She had come because of a letter. 3 weeks earlier, a formal envelope had arrived at the small apartment she shared with her grandmother. Inside was a brief message from attorney Daniel Foster requesting her presence at the Whitmore estate on this specific day. The letter contained no explanation. It simply stated that Richard Whitmore had personally instructed that she attend. Even now, Ava did not fully understand why. She had met Mr. Whitmore only a handful of times over the years. Those meetings had always seemed ordinary. At least that was what she believed. A uniformed attendant greeted guests at the entrance. His polite smile faded slightly when Ava approached. "Can I help you?" he asked. Ava carefully handed him her invitation. The man examined it twice. Then his eyes widened. "Welcome, Miss Brooks," he said, suddenly standing straighter. "Please come inside." The massive front doors opened. Ava stepped into a breathtaking foyer illuminated by crystal chandeliers hanging nearly 30 feet overhead. Marble floors reflected the warm light. Portraits of past generations lined the walls. The house felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to power and history. Voices echoed from the grand hall ahead where dozens of relatives, executives, investors, and longtime associates had gathered. As Ava entered the room, conversations gradually slowed. Heads turned. Expressions shifted. No one recognized her. No one understood why she was there. A few guests exchanged whispers. One woman quietly laughed. Another shook her head. Ava felt every pair of eyes following her. For a moment, she considered leaving. Then she remembered something Richard Whitmore had once told her during a brief conversation years ago. Never walk away from a room simply because someone else thinks you do not belong there. Ava straightened her shoulders and continued forward. Across the room, seated beside a polished oak table, attorney Daniel Foster finally looked up and noticed her arrival. His serious expression softened immediately. Then, beside him, resting atop a stack of legal documents, sat a sealed ivory envelope marked with a single handwritten instruction in Richard Whitmore's unmistakable signature. "Open only when Ava Brooks is present." Daniel Foster rose from his chair as Ava Brooks entered the grand hall. Unlike everyone else in the room, he did not look surprised to see her. In fact, he seemed relieved. The attorney adjusted his glasses and offered her a small nod of welcome before returning his attention to the documents spread across the oak table. Ava noticed the sealed ivory envelope again. Even from across the room, It seemed important. The handwritten instruction on its surface drew her attention immediately, but before she could study it further, the whispers around her grew louder. Guests who had arrived expecting a straightforward reading of the billionaire's estate could not stop looking in her direction. Some spoke quietly. Others made little effort to hide their curiosity. Ava walked toward an empty chair near the back of the room and sat down carefully. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to ignore the attention. A woman wearing an expensive emerald dress leaned toward the man beside her. "Do you know who she is?" she whispered. The man shook his head. "No idea." Another guest glanced toward Ava and shrugged. "Maybe she is someone's granddaughter." A few people chuckled softly. Ava heard enough to understand that nobody expected her to be there. She lowered her eyes and focused on remaining calm. Across the room hung a massive portrait of Richard Whitmore. The billionaire's familiar smile seemed unchanged from the last time she had seen him nearly 2 years earlier. Looking at the portrait brought back memories she had almost forgotten. She remembered volunteering at a community literacy event organized by a local foundation. Most people had gathered around celebrities and business leaders, hoping for photographs and attention. Richard Whitmore had done something different. He had spent nearly an hour speaking with children, listening more than talking. Ava had been one of those children. Their conversation had been brief, but he had treated her as though her thoughts mattered. Over the following years, their paths crossed only occasionally through foundation events and educational programs. He always remembered her name. Ava never understood why. A sudden movement near the front of the room interrupted her thoughts. Several members of the Whitmore family had arrived together. At their center was Margaret Whitmore. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the afternoon would end exactly as she expected. Many guests greeted her warmly. Some quietly assumed she would become one of the largest beneficiaries of the estate. Margaret accepted their attention graciously before taking a seat near the front. Her eyes eventually drifted toward Ava. The look lasted only a moment, but it communicated clear confusion. Ava looked away. The room gradually filled until nearly every seat was occupied. Conversations continued, though most centered on one topic: Richard Whitmore's fortune and who might inherit it. Daniel Foster checked his watch before organizing the final stack of documents. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Guests straightened in their chairs. Voices faded. Anticipation replaced conversation. Then Daniel carefully placed one hand atop the sealed ivory envelope. The movement was subtle, yet it captured Ava's attention instantly. She noticed something that made her heart beat faster. Beneath Richard Whitmore's handwritten instruction was a second line she had not seen before. It contained only 3 words: "For Ava Brooks." The room became noticeably quieter after guests noticed the words written beneath Richard Whitmore's instruction. Most people were too far away to read them, but Ava could not stop thinking about what she had seen. For Ava Brooks. The words felt impossible. Why would one of the most successful businessmen in America leave a sealed envelope specifically for her? She sat perfectly still while questions filled her mind. Across the room, Attorney Daniel Foster continued arranging documents with careful precision. His calm expression revealed nothing. It was obvious he had known about the envelope for a long time. The grandfather clock near the fireplace chimed softly. The sound echoed through the hall and signaled the official beginning of the proceedings. Daniel stood and addressed the gathering. "Thank you all for coming." His voice carried effortlessly through the room. Conversations stopped immediately. Every guest focused their attention on him. As many of you know, Richard Whitmore prepared extensive instructions regarding the administration of his estate. Several relatives nodded. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Daniel continued. Today's purpose is to review those instructions exactly as he requested. Margaret Whitmore sat confidently near the front. Her posture reflected certainty. She seemed convinced that the afternoon would confirm everything she already believed. Daniel began reading preliminary documents. The first section addressed charitable donations. Millions of dollars had been designated for educational foundations, community programs, and medical research initiatives. Guests listened politely, though many appeared more interested in the portions involving family inheritance. Ava listened carefully. The more she heard, the more she recognized Richard's values. He had always spoken about creating opportunities for others. Hearing the details made her smile. Nearly 40 minutes passed. One document followed another. Various properties, investments, and business interests were assigned according to Richard's instructions. Several beneficiaries received substantial assets. A few guests appeared pleased. Others seemed disappointed. Yet Daniel had not touched the ivory envelope. Ava noticed that every time someone glanced toward it, Daniel quietly placed a hand over it, as though protecting something important. Eventually, one of Richard's distant relatives raised a hand. "Excuse me," the man said. "Are we going to discuss that envelope?" A few people laughed softly. Daniel looked toward him calmly. "Yes," he replied. "At the appropriate time." The answer only increased curiosity throughout the room. Margaret folded her arms. "What exactly is inside it?" she asked. Daniel offered a polite smile. "Mr. Whitmore instructed me not to discuss its contents until specific conditions were met." More whispers spread across the gathering. Ava shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She wished people would stop looking in her direction. Yet she could feel their attention growing with each passing minute. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel closed the document he had been reading and looked toward the large portrait hanging above the fireplace. For a brief moment, his serious expression softened. "Many of you knew Richard as a businessman," he said. "I had the privilege of knowing him as a friend." The room grew quiet again. There was a side of him that rarely appeared in newspapers or financial reports. Several guests listened more carefully now. Daniel continued. Some of his most important decisions were never about money. Ava felt her heart beat faster. Something in his voice suggested the meeting was about to change direction. Daniel returned his attention to the table. Slowly, deliberately, he placed both hands on the sealed ivory envelope. The movement captured every eye in the room. Then he spoke the sentence Richard Whitmore had instructed him to say before opening it. "Everything you believe about today's inheritance is incomplete." The silence that followed Daniel Foster's statement seemed to settle over every corner of Whitmore Manor. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The attorney's words lingered in the air. "Everything you believe about today's inheritance is incomplete." Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Margaret Whitmore narrowed her eyes. Her confidence had not disappeared, but for the first time all afternoon, doubt appeared beneath it. Daniel remained standing behind the oak table. One hand rested lightly on the sealed ivory envelope, while the other remained atop a stack of legal documents. Ava Brooks sat quietly near the back of the room, her attention fixed entirely on the envelope. She still could not understand why her name appeared on it. Daniel looked around the gathering before speaking again. Richard anticipated that many people would arrive today expecting answers about wealth. A few guests shifted in their seats. He understood that discussions about inheritance often focus on assets, ownership, and financial value. Daniel paused, but he specifically instructed me to remind everyone that the most important part of his legacy cannot be measured in dollars. The room remained silent. Several family members appeared confused. Others looked impatient. They had come expecting a straightforward reading of an estate. Instead, the afternoon seemed to be moving towards something entirely different. Daniel carefully opened a separate folder and removed a single sheet of paper. 3 years ago, he continued, Richard began documenting a series of personal reflections. The audience listened closely. These reflections were not intended for publication. They were written solely to accompany the instructions he left behind. Daniel glanced down at the page. One entry in particular became very important to him. Ava felt her heart beating faster. Something told her she was about to hear a side of Richard Whitmore that very few people had known. Daniel began reading. Success creates an unusual problem. The more visible a person becomes, the easier it is to forget the people who receive no attention at all. The room listened quietly. Some of the most remarkable individuals I have met were invisible to everyone except those willing to truly see them. Daniel lowered the page briefly. Richard wrote those words after attending a literacy event in Savannah. Ava immediately remembered the event. She had been 7 years old. Daniel continued reading. During that afternoon, I met a child who reminded me that character often appears long before achievement. Several guests looked around the room curiously. Margaret folded her arms. Others leaned forward. Daniel returned the page to the folder. Richard revisited that memory many times during the following years. Ava lowered her eyes. The memory felt distant now. She remembered reading aloud from a children's book while volunteers encouraged students to participate. She remembered Richard asking questions about her favorite subjects in school. She remembered him listening carefully. Nothing about the encounter had seemed extraordinary. Yet Daniel's words suggested otherwise. The attorney continued. Over time, Richard arranged to receive updates regarding educational programs connected to his foundation. More curious expressions appeared throughout the room. Among those updates was information regarding one student whose perseverance consistently impressed him. Ava felt dozens of eyes gradually turning toward her. The attention made her uncomfortable. Daniel noticed, but continued. Richard believed potential should be recognized before success arrives. The statement was followed by complete silence. Then one guest finally asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. What does any of this have to do with the envelope? Daniel looked toward the speaker calmly. A faint smile crossed his face. Then he placed both hands on the ivory envelope once again. Everything, he replied. The tension inside Whitmore Manor seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. After Daniel Foster's answer, the room filled with restless curiosity. Guests exchanged glances. Family members whispered among themselves. Everyone wanted to know what connection could possibly exist between a 10-year-old girl sitting quietly in the back row and a sealed envelope left by one of the wealthiest men in America. Ava Brooks wished she could disappear. The attention made her uncomfortable. She had never enjoyed being the center of attention, especially in a room filled with strangers who clearly believed she did not belong there. Daniel remained calm. Years of legal experience had taught him how to manage difficult rooms, and this gathering was becoming increasingly difficult. He slowly lifted the ivory envelope and examined Richard Whitmore's handwriting one final time. Several guests leaned forward. Margaret Whitmore watched closely. Her confidence was beginning to crack beneath growing uncertainty. Before I open this envelope, Daniel said, there is one final instruction I must share. The room became silent again. Daniel unfolded a small note attached to the back of the envelope. Richard anticipated skepticism. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. He expected questions. He expected disagreement. Daniel looked around the room, and he specifically instructed me to remind everyone that assumptions are often the greatest obstacle to truth. The statement was met with silence. Then a man seated near the front laughed quietly. With all due respect, he said, this entire situation seems unnecessary. Several people nodded in agreement. We are discussing a child who has no connection to the family. More murmurs followed. Ava lowered her eyes. The words stung, even though she had heard similar things before. Margaret finally spoke. I think everyone here is wondering the same thing. She turned slightly toward Daniel. Why was she invited? Her question immediately captured the attention of the entire room. Daniel looked toward Ava briefly before answering. Because Richard personally requested it. Margaret folded her arms. That does not explain why. A few guests quietly laughed. One woman shook her head. Perhaps. Richard simply wanted to make a charitable gesture. Another guest smiled. That seems more likely. More soft laughter spread through the room. Ava felt her cheeks grow warm. She focused on the portrait above the fireplace and tried not to listen. Daniel allowed the comments to continue for a few moments before raising his hand. The room gradually quieted. I knew Richard for more than 30 years, he said firmly. He was many things, but he was never careless. The laughter disappeared immediately. Daniel continued. Every instruction contained within this estate was considered carefully. Every decision had purpose. His voice remained calm, but carried unmistakable authority. No one interrupted him now. The attorney looked directly at Margaret. If Richard wanted Ava Brooks present today, there was a reason. Silence followed. Then Daniel carefully broke the wax seal on the envelope. The simple sound seemed louder than it should have been. Every eye in the room focused on his hands. Ava felt her heart racing. Inside the envelope rested several folded pages. Daniel removed them slowly and placed the empty envelope aside. He examined the first page for a moment before looking toward Ava. Something in his expression changed. It was not surprise. It was recognition. Then he looked back at the audience. The first sentence of Richard's letter begins with a name. The room became completely still. Daniel glanced down at the page one more time. Then he read the opening words aloud. If Ava Brooks is present, then everything may finally be explained. The words echoed through the grand hall and seemed to stop time itself. If Ava Brooks is present, then everything may finally be explained. No one spoke. No one moved. Every eye in the room turned toward the small figure seated near the back. Ava felt her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if others could hear it. She had arrived believing she would simply attend a legal proceeding. Now the billionaire's personal letter had begun with her name. Daniel Foster waited for the silence to settle before continuing. His voice remained calm and measured. The following words were written by Richard Whitmore approximately 6 months before his passing. He unfolded the first page completely and began reading. To my family, friends, colleagues, and everyone gathered today. If this letter is being read, then Ava Brooks has arrived exactly as I hoped she would. Several guests exchanged stunned glances. Margaret Whitmore stared at the attorney in disbelief. Daniel continued, "Before I explain why she is here, I want everyone to understand something important. The greatest investment I ever made was not in a company, a building, or a financial market. It was in people." The room remained silent. Ava listened carefully. The words sounded exactly like Richard. Daniel read on. "Over the course of my life, I met countless individuals with talent. Far fewer possessed character. Character is what matters when no one is watching. Character is what determines whether opportunity becomes meaningful." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. The letter felt less like a legal document and more like a personal lesson. Daniel turned to the next page. 3 years ago, during a literacy program supported by my foundation, I met a young girl who demonstrated something rare. She treated every person she encountered with kindness, regardless of who they were. Ava lowered her eyes. Memories returned immediately. She remembered volunteering after school. She remembered helping younger children learn to read. She remembered encouraging classmates who struggled. None of it had seemed extraordinary. Daniel continued reading. I watched her share books she could barely afford. I watched her help others without expecting recognition. Most importantly, I watched her persevere through circumstances that would have discouraged many adults. The room grew quieter with every sentence. People who had laughed earlier now listened intently. Margaret's expression slowly shifted from skepticism to confusion. Daniel reached another page. Over the following years, I quietly followed Ava's educational progress through foundation reports. Not because she asked for help, not because she expected anything from me, but because I wanted to know whether the qualities I witnessed that afternoon were genuine. Daniel paused, briefly before continuing. They were. Ava felt emotion rising in her chest. She had never known Richard paid attention after their meetings. She never imagined he remembered so much. Daniel continued. Every report confirmed what I already suspected. Intelligence can create success. Character creates significance. Several guests nodded despite themselves. The words carried undeniable sincerity. Then Daniel reached the final paragraph on the page. He looked up briefly before reading it aloud. Everything I have written so far explains why Ava Brooks earned my respect. What follows explains why she earned something far greater. The atmosphere changed instantly. Curiosity returned. Guests leaned forward. Family members exchanged nervous glances. Margaret sat perfectly still. Daniel carefully turned to the next page. His expression grew more serious. Then he looked directly toward Ava before speaking. The next section contains information that no one in this room has ever heard before. The anticipation inside Whitmore Manor became almost unbearable. No one spoke after Daniel Foster's final sentence. The next section contains information that no one in this room has ever heard before. Every guest remained focused on the attorney. Even the relatives who had spent the afternoon discussing inheritance and property seemed to forget about money for a moment. Something far more important was about to be revealed. Daniel carefully adjusted the pages in his hands and continued reading Richard Whitmore's letter. If you are hearing these words, then I am no longer able to explain this personally. For that reason, I have entrusted the truth to Daniel. The room remained silent. Daniel continued. Several years ago, I established a private educational trust. The trust was designed to support students who demonstrated exceptional character, resilience, and potential. A few guests nodded. That sounded consistent with Richard's philanthropic work. Nothing about it seemed surprising. Yet Daniel's expression suggested the important part had not arrived. He turned to the next paragraph. The trust was never intended to support hundreds of students. It was created for one specific individual. Several guests exchanged curious glances. Margaret Whitmore leaned forward slightly. Ava felt her pulse quicken. Daniel continued reading. The first day I met Ava Brooks, I recognized something that reminded me of my own childhood. She possessed determination without entitlement. ambition without arrogance, kindness without expectation. Ava stared at the floor. Hearing those words felt overwhelming. She had never viewed herself the way Richard apparently had. Daniel read on. During the following years, I quietly ensured that educational opportunities remained available to her whenever she chose to pursue them. Every report I received confirmed my original judgment. Several people throughout the room were now looking directly at Ava. The earlier amusement had completely disappeared. Daniel paused briefly before continuing. However, this letter is not simply about a scholarship fund. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Guests straightened in their seats. Family members exchanged nervous glances. Daniel turned another page. Over time, Ava became something far more significant to me than a student supported by a foundation. The room fell silent once again. Margaret's expression tightened. Everyone sensed they were approaching the center of the mystery. Daniel continued. Many people spend their lives searching for evidence that the future will be better than the past. Ava provided that evidence. The attorney looked down at the page carefully. She reminded me that integrity still exists, that compassion still matters, that character can still flourish despite difficult circumstances. Several guests lowered their eyes. The sincerity of Richard's words was impossible to ignore. Then Daniel reached the next paragraph. He stopped briefly before reading. For that reason, I made a decision that many people will find unexpected. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ava felt her hands trembling slightly. Daniel continued. The educational trust established in Ava Brooks's name will remain active throughout her life. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Educational trust. The phrase immediately suggested something substantial. Yet Daniel had not finished. The trust currently contains sufficient assets to provide educational opportunities, professional development, housing assistance, and future support according to guidelines outlined in accompanying documents. More whispers followed. Margaret looked stunned. Several relatives exchanged worried glances. But Daniel's expression revealed there was still more to come. He slowly lowered the page and looked directly toward the audience. Everything I have read so far explains the trust. His voice remained calm. The next page explains why Richard ordered this envelope to remain sealed until Ava Brooks personally arrived at Whitmore Manor. The room became completely silent once again. The silence inside the hall felt almost unreal. Every guest remained focused on Daniel Foster as he held the final pages of Richard Whitmore's letter. No one seemed interested in the estate anymore. The mystery surrounding Ava Brooks had become the center of everyone's attention. Even Margaret Whitmore, who had arrived expecting discussions about inheritance and family assets, sat motionless as she waited for the next revelation. Daniel carefully turned the page. His eyes moved slowly across the words before he began reading again. If you have reached this portion of the letter, then you now understand why Ava earned my admiration. The attorney paused briefly. What you do not yet understand is why I asked Daniel to wait until she was physically present before revealing the remainder of my instructions. Ava listened closely. Her hands rested tightly together in her lap. She felt as though her entire life had somehow led to this moment. Yet she still had no idea what was coming. Daniel continued. For years, many people assumed my greatest concern was preserving wealth. They were mistaken. Several guests lowered their eyes. Wealth survives when institutions are strong. Character survives only when people choose to protect it. The room remained silent. Daniel read on. One afternoon, Ava asked me a question that I never forgot. Ava looked up in surprise. She could barely remember all of her conversations with Richard. Daniel continued reading. She asked why successful people spend so much time building large companies, but so little time building opportunities for children. A ripple of surprise spread through the audience. Ava suddenly remembered asking the question during a foundation event. She had been curious, nothing more. Yet Richard had remembered it years later. Daniel continued. The question stayed with me because it revealed something rare. Ava was not interested in what people owned. She was interested in what they left behind. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. The words carried unusual weight coming from a billionaire. Daniel reached the next section. That conversation inspired a project that remained private throughout the final years of my life. Curiosity returned immediately. Daniel continued. With Daniel's assistance, I established the Whitmore Legacy Initiative. The audience listened carefully. The initiative was designed to identify young people with exceptional character and provide opportunities that traditional systems often fail to provide. Several guests nodded. The idea sounded exactly like something Richard would create. Yet Daniel was not finished. The program was intentionally kept confidential until after my passing. He paused, and Ava Brooks became its first official participant. Soft gasps spread throughout the room. Ava felt stunned. She had never heard of the initiative. Daniel continued reading. The educational trust already discussed serves as the financial foundation of this program. The room remained silent. However, the trust itself is not the reason for today's gathering. The tension returned instantly. Margaret's eyes narrowed again. Daniel slowly lowered the page and picked up a separate document attached behind the letter. His expression grew more serious. Richard included an additional instruction regarding the future administration of the initiative. Several guests leaned forward. Daniel glanced briefly toward Ava before continuing. The instruction identifies an individual who will eventually guide the values, mission, and long-term direction of the Whitmore Legacy Initiative. Curiosity filled the room once more. Then Daniel unfolded the final page. The document carried Richard Whitmore's signature across the bottom. The attorney studied it briefly before looking up. What I am about to read has never been disclosed to anyone outside Richard and myself. The room became completely still. Then Daniel spoke the sentence that immediately changed every expression in the hall. Richard personally selected Ava Brooks as the future steward of the legacy he believed mattered most. For several seconds after Daniel Foster finished reading, absolute silence filled Whitmore Manor. No one seemed capable of speaking. The revelation was not what anyone had expected. Guests had arrived anticipating discussions about money, ownership, and inheritance. Instead, they had witnessed something far more powerful. Richard Whitmore had entrusted the future of his most important legacy to a 10-year-old girl who had walked into the room completely alone. Ava Brooks sat motionless. She struggled to process everything she had heard. The educational trust, the private initiative, the years of encouragement she never knew existed. Most surprising of all was the realization that Richard had seen potential in her long before she had seen it in herself. Daniel carefully lowered the final page. His expression softened as he looked toward Ava. "There is one final paragraph," he said quietly. The room immediately became attentive again. Daniel lifted the letter and read the closing words Richard Whitmore had written. To Ava, "If you are hearing this, then I hope you understand something that took me many years to learn. Success is not measured by how much a person receives. It is measured by how many opportunities they create for others. You once asked what people leave behind. My answer is simple. We leave behind the lives we help improve. That is why I chose you. Not because of who you are today, but because of who you are becoming." Ava felt tears forming in her eyes. Across the room, several guests quietly lowered their heads. Even those who had doubted her now seemed moved by Richard's words. Daniel continued reading. "I have complete faith that you will use every opportunity wisely. More importantly, I believe you will help others do the same. That is the legacy I wish to leave behind. And that is why the future of the Whitmore Legacy Initiative belongs to your stewardship when the time is right." Daniel lowered the letter. The reading was finished. For a moment, no one moved. Then something remarkable happened. Margaret Whitmore slowly rose from her chair. Ava felt nervous as the woman approached. Earlier in the afternoon, Margaret had clearly questioned her presence. Now her expression was entirely different. She stopped beside Ava and offered a respectful smile. "Your presence here makes sense now," she said softly. The words were simple, but they carried genuine sincerity. One by one, other guests approached as well. The laughter that had greeted Ava's arrival had disappeared completely. In its place came respect, not because of money, not because of status, because the truth had finally been revealed. Daniel watched quietly from the front of the room. He knew Richard would have appreciated this moment. Not the surprise, not the legal outcome, the understanding. People were finally seeing Ava the way Richard had seen her years earlier. Outside, the afternoon sun began to settle beyond the estate grounds, casting warm golden light through the tall windows of the hall. The portrait of Richard Whitmore seemed almost alive beneath the glow. Ava looked toward it one last time. She remembered the advice he had given her years ago. Never walk away from a room simply because someone else thinks you do not belong there. Now she understood why those words mattered. She had arrived at Whitmore Manor believing she was attending someone else's story. Instead, she discovered she had been part of Richard Whitmore's legacy all along. And as the guests gathered around her, offering congratulations and encouragement, Ava realized something even more important. The envelope had never been about revealing what Richard chose to leave behind. It had been about revealing who he believed could carry that legacy forward.